As a starting point, I would take your interview to the Unheard, which you made. When was it? A year or so? I can, it was
Yeah, maybe something like 9 months ago or
9 months
something.
ago. All right.
Not sure, but I
Yeah.
think
Well, not so important
be
either.
longer. Be longer. I don't remember it exactly.
Yeah, but that's not that important either. Okay, I can look it up. The title of the interview was that we are going through a metaphysical revolution. That's I very much share this opinion, and I felt the same for a couple of years. But that's a serious claim at the same time. And how could you please give in broad outline how you reach that conclusion or this idea? How did this idea dawn on you that we are going through a metaphysical revolution?
Yes. The concept itself, the concept of the metaphysical revolution, is a concept that actually used from Michel Houellebecq. I don't know if you know Michel
Yeah,
Houellebecq,
of course.
the
Yeah.
guy who wrote, yes, the famous book Elementary Particles, which implicitly, sometimes explicitly, actually scrutinizes and criticizes the materialist view on man in the world, and the way in which this view on man in the world led to what is often referred to as anatomized
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
humanity, an anatomized society. And like, um, of course, I interpret this concept of the metaphysical revolution in my own way, but I believe we truly are. For me, a society goes through a metaphysical revolution every time uh, it goes through a shift at the level of the symbolic framework or the worldview that structures its reality. And at this moment, our society structures its reality, or the symbolic framework of our society actually is this materialist view of man in the world, which, let's say, always existed, but became dominant somewhere starting in the 17th century when Galileo Galilei, people the likes of Newton and stuff, who actually were not materialists. They usually had a religious view on life and existence, but their discoveries or the theories they articulated were so successful in manipulating a certain part of reality that very soon certain philosophers, like de la Mettrie, for instance, and others, usually absolutely not top-notch philosophers, absolutely not. They were rather naive failures, I believe, as a philosopher. But they promoted this idea that this little aspect of reality, which can be understood in a mechanist, in a materialist way, that actually this little part of reality, aspect of reality, represented reality in its entirety. And that worldview uh, became dominant very soon, probably because it's simple. It's extremely simple. It provides people, or it allows people to live under the illusion that we can completely rationally understand reality, and also that we can completely manipulate it and completely control it. And to this extent that in the end, and the first people who articulated this idea were people like Saint-Simon, and nowadays we have Yuval Noah Harari, of course. They are soon articulated this idea that um, uh, actually the human being as a part of this mechanistic reality can also be understood completely. That we can understand the most minor details of the human being, including, for instance, its brain, which within this worldview is nothing more than a biochemical process, complex biochemical architecture with a biochemical process in it. And that very soon we would be able to remove all the glitches and all the mistakes in the machinery, and make the human being live forever in a state of what I often call biochemically induced happiness, eternal happiness. And so that's probably what is so enticing, so seductive for the human being. This illusion that he on the basis of his rational understanding, he can control and manipulate everything and enter a new kind of paradise which God actually always promised us but never gave us. Human being will be able to create that paradise himself. So that's literally what someone like Yuval Noah Harari is saying, and what, strangely enough, certain people as Joe Rogan, for instance, also believe. Like I heard him saying, like Elon Musk's Neuralink chip will speed up evolution, and it will do what in a few years what natural evolution would maybe be able to do in a few million years. And that this Neuralink chip will be implanted in the brain, and we will communicate through an artificial language, which transfers information between human beings perfectly, without mistakes, which also immediately shows us what mental and emotional status of the people we interact with. It will show us whether the other is angry with us, whether the other hates us or not. And it will make that people cannot lie anymore, that hate is powerless because it will be detected immediately, and also it will stimulate exactly the same neurons as the ones involved in these experiences people have when they use psychedelics like mescaline. And in that way, it will bring people straight forward to paradise without adverse effects, and also without having to pay a lot for the drugs they use. And so that's what people expect of this. That's probably what makes this materialist film Man in the World so attractive. Like people, and in a strange way, of course, you can see from the beginning that there is a complete contradiction in it, because at the same time, if this materialist film Man in the World is true, then it means that the human being is nothing more than a cog, a passive cog in the machine of the universe. So, meaning that the human being has no power at all. The human being is completely powerless, actually, within this mechanistic field man and all. But strangely enough, at the same time, it makes people believe that they will become almighty, that they will have the power of a god. So there is a contradiction from the beginning in it. But people don't care, because people prefer to live in a nice illusion rather than face a reality which maybe rather tells them that they will have to try to transcend themselves through hard work and a lot of discipline, um, uh, and so on. And so this materialist film Man in the World, it became dominant, and it is at the moment. And I believe that uh, all of us, myself included, somewhere think and behave like materialists. But some of us, myself included, I think, feel that there is something wrong with it, and believe that we will have to find a way to transcend that materialist film Man in the World. That's what my next book is all about. I connect it to the act of speech. It's the act of speech, a reappreciation of the act of sincere speech is the only thing that can allow us to go through this metaphysical revolution, and find a new way of human living together. So because that's what I believe the metaphysical revolution is. Like we live in an era now where this materialist view man in the world is coming to its ultimate consequence. As soon as you start from that materialist view of man in the world, the inevitable consequence at the level of the organization of society is that we should organize society as a technocracy. Of course, of course. If the universe is a machine, if human living together, human existence is actually nothing more than a biochemical phenomenon, a part of the machinery, then the people who lead, who are in control of the machine, shouldn't be democratically elected people. Why would you ask a democratically elected person who maybe doesn't know anything about the machine to be to take the lead and to be in control of the machine? That's bullshit. You need an expert, a technical expert in that case. So, and that's, I believe that most of the academics, they won't say that out loud, but they all think like that. Give them one bottle of wine and ask them, like, okay, do you think democracy is the right system? They will all start saying, no, democracy, we will never be able to counter climate change with democracy. People won't do it. So we need the most technically and rationally skilled people to understand what's going on, to tell us what is going on, and to tell us what to do actually. And then I'm not inventing this here on the spot. I mean, people like Walter Lippmann, who is believed to be the most influential journalist of the 20th century. That's exactly what he was saying. He won the Pulitzer Prize 2 times, and his view on journalism was a radically technocratic and anti-democratic view. He said, like, journalism doesn't work. Free journalism doesn't work. The average journalist is not capable of interpreting reality in the right way. So we need experts to construct the basic frames that journalists can use to interpret what happens in society. These frames have to be distributed through central press agencies, and at least for everything that really matters, not for one or another local event, but for what happens at the level of geopolitics, for instance. And then these journalists can use these frames to create their narratives. And so that guy actually was probably the most influential journalist of the 20th century. And what he disseminated was a technocratic view on journalism. And I can understand them. I can understand them because democracy is problematic. It is it's problematic. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, in a certain sense was right when he said it doesn't work. But at the same time, it's clear that the solution people came up with for this problematic nature of democracy was even much more problematic. Like, if you read people like Edward Bernays, who is believed to be the founding father of modern propaganda, and people like Lippmann, for instance, or Trotter, they all conclude the same. Most people are too stupid and too cruel to think for themselves. So, in a democratic system, the majority, the masses will take control because of the election system. And that means inevitably that we will fall prey to the irrationality and the destructiveness of the masses. So the leaders are not really leaders in a democracy. They are followers because the masses impose their will to them. So what we need is, we will constantly need to manipulate the population in such a way that they do what we want them to do without them knowing that they do what we want them to do. That's where modern propaganda started. That's where journalism actually became, without journalists usually realizing it, in most cases, part of a propaganda system. And So that's this idea. I can understand this idea of we need to manipulate them, but I don't agree, because trying to create a humane society by manipulating people is throwing away from the very onset, from the start of your project, what the essence is of a humane society, namely sincere speech. So that's a problem. It shows that people like Lippmann and Bernays and all these people who blindly follow them, that they actually didn't appreciate and didn't realize what the psychological function and importance is of the phenomenon of truth speech for a human being. My next book is all about that. It presents a psychological and historical analysis of what it means for a human being to speak the truth and what the consequences are when we stop doing it. The consequences are nothing less than this: it means that all ethical awareness will disappear from human living together, from society. And as Hannah Arendt said, it will lead us straight to hell, straight to the point where Werner Heisenberg, the famous quantum physicist, warned us for. He said, we are at the point where we are at risk that the soul will die.
Mm.
The world is de-souling. And that, he said, will bring us in a situation which is much, 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 much worse than concentration camps and nuclear bombs. Yeah. So that's the physical revolution, I believe.
Yeah, but in your last book, you show the mechanism, how the totalitarian, how the mechanistic ideology leads to totalitarianism, and obviously, Corona must have been a sort of wake-up call for the most of people. But were there signs? I mean, did your interest in totalitarianism start with Corona, or did you see was the interest already there before that? And if yes, what provoked your
Yeah, yes, it was already there before that, because I started my academic career in 2003 at Ghent University. Started to do a PhD. I was expected to do a classical research in psychology, and as soon as I started it, I decided, like, look, I won't continue with it, because it's so clear that this research actually is not real science. That psychologists constantly claim that they measure all kinds of psychological characteristics, but if you take a closer look at the measurements, it's clear that these measurements actually do not measure anything in an objective way. And I asked my promoter, like I said, like, look, I cannot do such research. Let me do my PhD about the quality of research in psychology. That's what I did. I got an additional master in statistics then, and that's I don't really like statistics, but I like mathematics. I like physics. That's, for instance, why I'm here in Geneva now, because I'm writing a few chapters on materialism considered from the perspective of modern science. And while I was writing my PhD, I was really surprised. I didn't expect that, but at that moment, like after 1 or 2 years, the replication crisis started in the sciences. And it showed something that people up until now do not fully realize. It basically showed that almost all academic papers are bullshit. Almost all. You can prove it in up to 80% of the papers, because they cannot be reproduced, which is even much worse than that they cannot be replicated. But it's much, much worse than that. But the remaining 20% of the papers just doesn't mean that these 20% are correct or right or have a certain validity. It means that we don't know. We cannot be sure that they are bullshit for these 20%, but probably of these 20%, an additional 19% will also be bullshit. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It was a disaster. It showed, like, for everyone who wanted to see it, that academic research found itself in an extremely problematic situation where that it got completely perverted, actually. And I wrote my first book was The Pursuit of Objectivity and Psychology. The title of my first book was based on my PhD, The Pursuit of Objectivity and Psychology. And that first book, it made me a little bit famous in the world of psychology, but in a very problematic way. Like 95% of the psychologists were angry at me.
Mm.
And a few of them were really enthusiastic. Finally, someone who could say in a clear and tangible way why psychology is not a science at all. And in the third part of the book was I showed that there was a way for psychology probably to become a science. And I believe that sometimes we have to be modest and sometimes we don't have to be modest. But I believe that up until now, it's the best analysis of and the best demonstration, like, where psychology shouldn't go and where it can go. I explain using the mathematics of complex dynamical systems theory that, like, most characteristics in psychology can never be measured because they are intrinsically multidimensional. And a phenomenon that is intrinsically multidimensional can never be measured. Not in physics. That's what Benoit Mandelbrot showed. Like, even something like the length of the coast of Great Britain can never be measured because it's intrinsically two-dimensional. You can never measure it. And or at least the measurement outcome will completely depend on your measurement scale. The shorter the scale, the longer the coast. So your measurement doesn't say anything, except if you relate it to the measurement unit you use. But even then, it's not objective or something. And in psychology, almost all characteristics are intrinsically multidimensional. As I explain it step by step with really examples a small child could see. And I used that book in my classes at Ghent University when I just had become a professor. And, like, many students said, like, we don't want to study this anymore, this kind of psychology. It's bullshit. And the educational committee of Ghent University decided that they couldn't use the book anymore because they claimed it was too difficult for students at that point in their career, which of course was bullshit because their problem exactly was that it was not too difficult, that students started to understand very well that what they were studying. So Ghent University didn't use the term, of course, my first book and my last book. That was all over the news in Belgium. Of course, they banned my book. And it was the only occasion where even mainstream journalists, many of them actually chose my side. They said, like, well, this goes too far. This Desmet is an anti-vaxxer and a conspiracy thinker, which is not true at all. I'm the right-wing extremist. That's also something they said, which I always ask them, like, look, give me one example why I would be an extreme right fascist or a conspiracy thinker. Like, of course, there are conspiracies. We all know that. Everyone with more than one brain cell working knows that there are conspiracies, but it doesn't mean that the entire reality is structured as a conspiracy, not at all. And so many people go much too far in that direction, and they just lack understanding of what complexity and complex systems mean. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But Ghent University, I think I'm really the only author in the history of Belgium who wrote two books, of which two were banned. And I can guarantee, if you read the books, there is nothing impolite. I do not insult anyone. Not at all. But so it shows like that at the moment where you start to really articulate fundamental criticism of mainstream dominant academic discourse, you will get in trouble. And that has never, you know, I accept that because it has always been like that. That's even the definition of sincere speech, of course. That sincere speech, whether it is factually correct or not, it doesn't matter. But when you say something sincerely, you articulate something that makes you vulnerable, that through which you literally reveal something. That literally means in Latin to pull away a curtain, to reveal, through which you show something that usually people hide behind what I often call the veil of appearances. So as a human being, we constantly, that's an expression Lacan used, Jacques Lacan used, French famous psychoanalyst. He said, like, as a human being, we are beings that constantly erase our traces. We hide. We try to hide who we are. And we constantly think like, okay, I hope they don't know that about me. I hope they don't see this characteristic of me. I hope I will do as if I will try to match a certain ideal image. So we constantly hide behind the veil of appearances. And the act of sincere speech, by definition, the act of truth speech, by definition, is an act through it that makes you vulnerable. Inevitably, it's inevitably, by definition, an act that makes you lose something in the world of appearances. Antique Greek culture knew that very well. The one who practices the parrhesia, bold speech, truth speech in public space, will be hated in many occasions and loved by others, but hated because he destroys the illusions that people use to find a certain stability. And so you will inevitably lose something in the real world. Lose something in the world of appearances and win something in the real world. And of course, like I explore this in the third part of the book. I explore what does it mean to speak the truth, and for a human being, it's definitely has nothing to do with the belief that you are the only one who knows the real knowledge or something. Not at all. It's even to the contrary. It means like that you acknowledge that you are not certain, and that it means like, look, I will say something of which I'm not certain that it is correct or something, but I will try to express something, to articulate something that I feel inside. That's speaking sincerely. That's the moment where you speak your most singular truth. And strangely enough, if you do it, if you just decide to try to articulate your most singular truth, strangely enough, that's the moment where you touch a universal string. So truth is a paradox. It's at the same time strictly singular and universal. So that, I think that's the revolution we are going through. So something in this rationalist, materialist view on man and the world made us lose touch with the phenomenon of truth. And our problems, both at the collective level, we are close to World War III, closer than ever. And at the individual level, almost everyone is in an individual crisis. Like 50 to 60% of the Americans is chronically ill. 25% of the world population is diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. Point prevalence, meaning at one moment. Lifetime prevalence would be much, much higher. So 60% of the people declares to be so lonely that they do not have one meaningful relationship. More than 40% of the people considers their own job to be a bullshit job. So we are in the most profound crisis probably humanity ever found itself in, at the collective and the individual level. And it's all one crisis. It's one big metaphysical crisis. And I believe that essentially the essence of the crisis And the point where we should focus our attention on is our relationship with truth. That's the most fundamental thing.
Right. One thing that particularly struck a chord with me in your book was that where you said that Corona crisis was the moment where the replication crisis kind of exploded into the public awareness. Could you just, for our readers, elaborate on that point a little bit?
Yes, the replication crisis was this moment in time, 2005. Usually it's situated, it's dated at 2005, when it started, where it became clear, like suddenly a few researchers, I would call them the real researchers, few of them said, like, look, let's be honest, if we try to replicate and to reproduce scientific papers or experiments or research, then it usually fails.
Would you name anybody in particular of those?
The most important paper, definitely, I think, was the paper of John Ioannidis, Stanford biomedical statistician. I exchanged some emails with him because he was one of the people who, during the Corona crisis, also said, like,
remember that very well.
Like me. So he published his famous paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, was the title. And, at that moment, like, the academic community acknowledged and admitted, like, okay, we have a problem. And they actually proposed all kinds of solutions, like trying to take the publication pressure away from researchers. But I immediately knew, like, these solutions won't work. There's no possibility that they will work because you could see it. In my opinion, while the intentions were good, actually what they tried to do was rather masking the problem than solving it. Because the real problem, as I described in my book, went straight through the most fundamental aspects of the rationalist worldview. And that's why I knew, like, it will never be solved, the problem, before our entire culture changes. And we see it now, like a few years ago, a new study asked researchers whether they actually manipulated their results. It was an anonymous inquiry. Up to 50% admitted anonymously that they changed and manipulated their findings. Up to 50%, that was even much more than what was observed in 2005, where, like, the failure to replicate the results usually was attributed to not so much to straightforward fraud, but to sloppiness or just statistical inaccuracies and stuff. So it's clear that the problem is not solved, and it cannot be solved within the current structure of our society and our culture. And this materialism has very specific epistemological starting points. It believes that we can know the world, for instance, by measuring it, which is true for a small part of the world of reality, but which is not true for the major part of reality, the most important part of reality. So like that's where I started from, and then like at the moment, like when I published my small book, and I could see that my colleagues, who usually are very intelligent people and often also nice people as a human being, but that most of them, absolutely, when I confronted them with evidence and examples that of which literally a small child could see they show that psychological measurements are crap. Like, I'll give you one example. Like, if you measure personality with a certain personality test, and you measure it today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, the results will usually be completely different to the extent that the correlations between the three series of measurements for many measures is zero, meaning that there is no relationship at all. So it shows by definition that such a measurement contains 100% error, because personality, by definition, refers to these characteristics that are stable over time in a human being. So if the measurement is not stable at all, it can measure anything, but definitely not personality. And so, like, when I confronted them with this evidence and I showed them very easy examples, mathematical simulations I made, most of them got angry. And that was the moment where I started to realize it is possible that an entire community is in the grip of a narrative that is completely absurd. Even when that community exists of highly intelligent people. And that's the moment where I have always been interested in mass psychology, a little bit. But that was the moment where I started to become really interested in it, because I started to realize, like, this strange expert blindness cannot be explained on the basis of individual psychology alone. You need to take into account that the human being is in the grip of groupthink, which is a small aspect of what I later called mass formation. And I started to study the phenomenon of mass formation, started to read about it, to lecture about it. And then the Corona crisis started. It was as if I could see everything that I had been experiencing at university. It was as if I could see everything happen again, but this time at the globalist scale, in the world village, let's say it like that. And I could see immediately. From the first week onwards, I studied the statistics. I immediately said they are wrong, completely wrong. And I published a paper immediately. And that was, like, at that moment, that was one of the most important decisions of my life. Because during the first week of the crisis, like, I was the first one in Belgium, or at least the first professor or someone with a certain authority who spoke out. I was the first one. And I'd like I hadn't expected it, but, like, I knew at that moment that I put everything at stake. I knew, like, if I'm wrong, and if this virus turns out to be a highly deadly killer virus, they will blame me of 90% of the people who die in Belgium, because I had this moment where I said, like, look, yes, you're taking a risk, but if you don't speak now, you better shut up for the rest of your life. And I decided to publish this opinion paper, The Fear of the Virus is More Dangerous Than the Virus Itself. And I hadn't expected it, but it like in a few hours of time, it was everywhere in Belgium. And even national television published it on its website. I often jokingly say, like, it was the last thing they published of me. After that, they published only fact checks about what I said. But and so it was as if everything happened again. It started with the statistics. I said, like, they are wrong. Of course they are wrong. The mortality rates are. I could even show the mistakes. Like, that's the mistake here. It's at least 10 times lower, the mortality rates. And from the first week onwards, I said, like, and what is happening now in our society at the psychological level is very similar to what happens when totalitarian systems emerge. And well, after 3 months, it was clear that the statistics had been wrong. Even the people who published the statistics, the people of Imperial College, just admitted it before the House of Commons. They just said, like, okay, we were wrong. Mortality rates were much, much, much lower. But it didn't change anything. The narrative continued. And that was when I decided I said, like, okay, I better focus at the psychological level. I can tell people as long as I want that the statistics are wrong. Won't change anything. And it took me a few months to realize that what was going on was a mass formation, or that it had something to do with mass psychology. That shows how strangely enough, how even when you're critical, you're still somewhere blinded by what's happening. It's the psychological processes are so strong that it's hard to see them. And well, so that was a moment where I came to the idea, like, this is a mass formation that is going on. This is the same. I sensed it somewhere. I felt it somewhere from the beginning, but to really understand it at a theoretical level, what was going on, it took me months. And as it's like, as Arthur Kessler, I don't know if you know that guy, Arthur Kessler. Yeah, he wrote this wonderful book, among some other books, The Sleepwalkers. It was as if I was sleepwalking towards this idea of mass formation. And then I said, like, okay, I will try to write an opinion paper about it, but I gave up like 200 times. Like I said, it's impossible. It's too complex. It's impossible to explain this in an accessible way. And then one night I woke up and I said, like, that's maybe a way I could put it in a concise way, and I did so. And then it, like, in a very short way, it spread around the world, I think, that idea. And then a few months later, I published my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which actually, somewhere in the middle part of it, goes into this phenomenon of mass formation and how it emerges as a consequence, because that's the most important thing for me. It's ultimately, it's not created by an evil elite. Of course there is an elite, and of course they use propaganda, much more than people think. But that's the emergence of that kind of thinking in the elite in itself is also a consequence of something. And the root cause of the problem is this materialist few men in the world, because it creates both this propaganda ideology on the one hand, and much more important, it creates this atomized state. It makes people more and more isolated, disconnected, lonely. And that's the state, of course, when people are completely disconnected and isolated and lonely. That's where they are so sensitive, so vulnerable for propaganda, and also just for mass formation. Under certain conditions, a mass formation can emerge spontaneously. We know by now that for sure that is not what happened in the Corona crisis. There was a lot of propaganda involved. But so that's what my book is about. That's what my book is about, like, about this, how this state of loneliness is in itself a consequence of the materialist worldview, and how it leads to totalitarianism. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You just touched this mass formation, and I've listened to your interview in Unheard. And there you referring this mass formation to Corona crisis, but could you give some more examples where you really see this mass formation
in action?
In action, yes.
Yes, well, mass formation happens quite frequently. Like, historically speaking, of course, like, it's very old. It was typical for human living together, I think. Like, the Crusades are often given as example. The Crusades, for instance, the witch hunts in the 17th, 16th century. Then, of course, the emergence of the Soviet Union, which was from the beginning an artificially created mass formation. So mass formation created through propaganda. Then the mass formations in Germany, Nazi Germany, which were in the beginning spontaneous mass formations, which after a while were sustained through propaganda. And then but I believe that the first global mass formation was Corona.
Mm.
So for the first time in history, there was a global narrative and a global mass formation. And well, that happens often at a small scale as well. For instance, in trials, I don't know if you're familiar with that. Do you use juries, so-called a jury during trials in?
No, we have other system. No.
Yes. So, but in a jury always functions as a mass, small mass, like and that's very well described by a French judge who concluded that there is only one reason to continue with this jury system, and this reason is that professional judges, or even worse than a jury, yes, even worse, he said, because the jury, strangely enough, they come to conclusions that are worse in much more cases than could be explained on the basis of chance. So, but the mass formations happen all the time, but they became stronger throughout the last 2 centuries just because more people feel lonely. I don't know. I think so. I think like this association between loneliness and mass formation has been observed. Like Hannah Arendt, for instance, mentions it. This association. She's one of the few people who understood that there is a correlation between an association between this loneliness and a mass formation. But she doesn't describe the psychological mechanisms. I think I'm the first one. Who described how this loneliness leads to mass formation. So I described it many times. It's like loneliness leads to lack of meaning making, lack of purpose and meaning in life, and then you have a very strange phenomena at the level of emotional functioning. People get very anxious, or at least there is anxiety, frustration, aggression, a lot that emerges in this lonely state. But it's a very specific kind of anxiety. It's an anxiety that is not associated to a mental representation, and that's the difference with the anxiety in, let's say, in medieval times, where people were also anxious.
This is what you call the free floating anxiety. Yeah?
Free floating anxiety, and it's that state.
Yeah.
When we feel anxious, but we don't know what we feel anxious for. We are desperately in need of a narrative, which at least provides us with the illusion that we know what we are anxious from. Yeah. So it's like Freud called that a falsche Verknüpfung, a false connection between a representation and anxiety. So we prefer a false connection over no connection at all as a point. And when people are in this state and someone disseminates a narrative providing an object of anxiety, then there's a very good chance that, and disseminates it through the mass media, there's a very good chance that all this free-floating anxiety will connect to the object of anxiety and the narrative, and that people will be willing to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if that strategy is completely absurd. And I believe that from the beginning, it was clear that the corona measures were in many respects absurd. And but people don't care. Just as they didn't care to fight objects of anxiety like the Jews or the aristocracy or the witches or no matter what, through absurd measures. And then the second thing happens, which is the essence of mass formation, like because everyone connects his or her anxiety, or many people connect their anxiety to the same object, participate in the same strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. The strategy to deal with the object of anxiety functions as a ritual, and this rituals or behaviors that have no pragmatic function, but that have a social function. They create a social bond. That's exactly what a ritual is. It is something you do not because it has a pragmatic function, but just to show the other people that you're part of the same group.
Mhm.
And that, so it seems through the mass formation, it seems as if people escape their loneliness and are united again. That explains the strange enthusiasm that we could see. Nurses dancing, clapping their hands, and so on. And I say it seems because, and that's so destructive and dramatic, of course, in a mass formation. It seems that as if people escape their loneliness, but they do not really escape their loneliness. They are even more lonely. And Sigmund Freud, whom is hated by so many people and despised by so many people, but whom I believe was one of the true geniuses of the Enlightenment culture. Sigmund Freud, he wrote actually only one paper that really focused on mass psychology. But I believe he made a major, maybe the most important contribution, which is rarely understood. It is it is as if people don't see what Freud really wanted to show them. What he really wanted to show was like that the mass is a group that is different from any other group. A fruitful connectedness in the group formation happens on the basis of connections between individuals. People form a group because they love each other a little bit. It's because there is a social bond from individual to individual. But in a mass, that's not what happens. In a mass is a group that emerges because each individual separately is connected to a collective ideal. And that the bond between the individual and the collective becomes much stronger. It sucks away all the love and the energy from the bonds between individuals, and it isolates people completely. That's why in the end, the bond with the collective is much stronger than the bond between individuals. That's why in the end, mothers report their children to the state. Children report their parents to the state as a dramatic end stage of a mass formation. And we have seen the Corona narrative. It suddenly lost its power, the Corona narrative, lost its grip, somewhere in, what was it, February, March 2022.
Right after the war.
Not before a new narrative emerged.
Exactly, yeah.
Ukraine, it was almost day after day. Like the Ukraine narrative emerged and provided society with a new object of anxiety, which had even more potential, of course, to bind aggression, to bind anxiety. The monster Putin, who would invade Europe. And, I published 2 articles about it. One article in which I show, look, this mainstream narrative on Ukraine is in many respects a false narrative. We are not innocent, not at all. The NATO is not innocent. But then I published a second paper to tell people that, of course, that doesn't mean that Putin is a saint. He's not a saint, not at all. If you look at his career, if you look at, of course, he was the right man at the right place at that moment. During Yeltsin, certain things were happening in Russia which would have meant the end of Russia. And Putin, I believe he's an authoritarian personality, authoritarian leader, and he took control and he changed things for the better, I think, in Russia. But of course, the system he installed is not. It also has many shadowy sides. I mean, that's what I describe in another article. But anyway, we now here. A major part of the population again blindly buys into a narrative which you say, look, unless you have no historical awareness at all, you cannot claim that Putin is started an unprovoked war there, and he won't stop before he conquers Europe and Brussels and so on and so on. I think it's not true. And that doesn't matter. The point is that the Ukraine narrative replaced the Corona narrative. Whether it was true or not, it had the same psychological function. Yeah.
Do you think they? Yeah, one of the most striking aspects of the corona, and that there has been not a shortage of them, is about my highly intelligent friend who didn't see any connection between the end of the corona narrative and the emergence of the Ukraine narrative. It just baffles me how I mean, how can you miss that connection? That right after the war started, corona just disappeared completely.
Yes, of course. That's the point. It makes people blind. Mass formation, and you can explain it in many ways. Like mass formation literally is a state of hypnosis. It's identical. It's identical. Everyone, from Gustave Le Bon to Sigmund Freud to Elias Canetti, who studied mass formation or mass psychology, will tell you exactly this. It's a state of hypnosis. And at the psychological level, the mechanism is identical, because hypnosis and mass formation are processes through which attention is focused on a very small aspect of reality. And the rest, people don't see the rest anymore. They only see, for instance, the dangers associated with the virus, and they become completely blind, strangely enough, for the dangers associated, or the dangers of the measures or the corona mandates themselves. For instance, you could tell people as much as you wanted, like, look, maybe some people will die of the virus, but with these measures, the lockdowns, they will claim millions of victims, much more than the coronavirus could claim in the worst case scenario. Even the UN mentioned that on their website in the first week of the crisis. They said, like, look, these measures probably will claim much more victims than the virus could claim if we do nothing. And of course, that was true. The average victim of the virus, the age of the average victim of the virus was exactly the age at which people usually die. It's exactly the same. So it's impossible to save life years through these measures. It's mathematically impossible. But you can tell that as much as you want, they won't see it, because their attention is all focused on these images of people dying in hospitals. The attention is completely captured by these images, meaning that the rest, the other victims, the victims claimed by the virus, by the measures, for instance, people will see them if you make them see it with their eyes, but they will have no psychological impact because there is no psychological energy attached to them. That's what this expert blindness is, or this blindness, mass formation induced blindness in general is. People, the only thing that has an impact on their psychological state is that what is in line with the narrative, and the rest has no impact at all.
Well, as the hour is up, just let me perhaps since we reached that point, there's one particular piece in your book that I very much like, that I'd like to comment on at the very end. This is perhaps the biggest problem with the great mechanistic narrative. The ultimate master of the sublunary, death, has not been given an acceptable part in it. Banned from the story, it terrifies us and creates frantic responses to every threat that end up more damaging than the problem itself. I think that's really sums it up. Would you like to comment on that? Or expand on it?
I would still write that. I think that's indeed, in a certain way, it's maybe the most important problem, that this materialist film Man in the World, indeed, it focuses our gaze, our attention on the visible world, and while doing so, it makes us believe that also we ourselves are identical to our visual aspects, to the image we see in the mirror. And that's the moment where love is transformed into narcissism. And that's the moment where people start to get isolated from each other, each isolated literally in their own narcissistic shell. And that's the moment where we stop resonating with the world around us. That's the moment where we stop feeling part of something eternal. So that's the moment where we start to feel very anxious when we think about death and dying. And that's the moment where we start to be very sensitive for narratives that tell us that if we don't participate in a strategy, we will soon die. So stuff like that. Yeah. So I believe that that's the major problem, yes, with our culture. In the end, fundamentally, to live and to create a truly humane human living together, you need to be prepared to die. And in order to be able to really live, you uh, have to be capable of dying and to accept that you will die. And that's what got lost. But people have always been scared of dying, of course, always. But it's like this little, now a little bit more than they used to be. And like in a complex dynamical system, a relatively small change in one of the essential parameters can make the entire system change. And that's what happened. Like people have always manipulated. Of course they did, always. But since the emergence of the rationalist field man in the world, a little bit more. Or maybe even much more. And that makes the difference. It's like one of the essential parameters changes a bit, and the entire system gets in a new equilibrium, a new state, which in the end can be extremely problematic.
Well, thank you so very much for your time and for your book. This book really kind of pulled for me many strings together that I've been interested in over the last like 5-6 years. So sincere thanks to you for that book and for what you've been doing. And wish you good evening and all the best in this.
No.